"You don't remember me, do you, Viking?" she whispered. 15 years ago, a girl saved your life and you promised to return for her. That girl was me. Now I flee from a fate I did not choose, and only you can help me." Ravensholm rested under the relentless sun of northern Norway, like a forgotten jewel in the midst of the fjords. It was the year 1247, and in that town where noble families clung to their privileges with the same fierceness that oak trees gripped the rocky cliffs, lived Astrid Erik's daughter, a young woman of 23 years whose name meant divine beauty, but whose life had been anything but beautiful. The Eriksson house stood in the main square as a permanent reminder of the power that the timber trade had brought to the family. Erik the Wealthy had built his fortune selling oak and pine to the great cities, and every coin earned he had invested in consolidating his social position. His wife Gunhild came from an ancient family of impoverished landowners who had seen in Erik the opportunity to recover their lost luster. From that calculated union, 3 children had been born: Bjorn, the firstborn who managed the family business with an iron fist; Torstein, the second son who had left to study law in the capital; and Astrid, the only daughter, whose existence had been a disappointment from the moment she was born. Gunhild had never forgiven her daughter for not being the son she expected. From childhood, Astrid had grown up hearing comparisons with other girls of society, always losing in those cruel evaluations. She was too quiet for her mother's taste, too dreamy, too interested in the books of medicine that her maternal grandfather had left before dying. While other young ladies embroidered and played the harp, Astrid read treatises on medicinal plants and watched as Helga, the old family servant, prepared home remedies for the workers at the docks. But everything had worsened when Astrid turned 15 and showed no interest in the suitors her family began to present. One after another, young men from good families arrived at the Eriksson house with flowers and promises, and one after another left bewildered by the girl's lack of enthusiasm. Gunhild blamed her daughter for having ridiculous expectations, for living in a fantasy world that did not exist. What Gunhild did not know, what no one in the family knew, was that Astrid's heart had been marked by an encounter that had occurred when she was barely 8 years old. It had been during the coldest winter that Ravensholm had ever known. Astrid used to escape from the etiquette lessons her mother insisted on giving her, taking refuge at the limits of the family property where the cultivated lands met the wild forest. It was there, hidden among the snow-covered rocks, that she found the boy. He was perhaps 10 years old. He was wounded in the leg and delirious with fever. His clothes and the amulet he wore around his neck clearly indicated he was a Viking warrior's son from the northern clans, one of those savages that adults spoke of with fear and contempt, the wild folk who raided coastal towns and lived by their own brutal laws. Astrid felt no fear. What she felt was an immediate urgency to help. For 3 days she stole food from the kitchen, fresh water from the well, and the medicinal herbs that Helga kept in the pantry. Each afternoon, after convincing her governess that she needed fresh air, she ran to the rocks where the boy was hiding. She treated his wound with the ointments she had seen Helga prepare, fed him, spoke to him in a low voice, though he barely understood her dialect, and she knew nothing of his northern tongue. On the 3rd day, when the fever finally broke, the boy looked at her with dark eyes full of gratitude. He tried to speak in broken Norwegian. "You saved my life," he murmured. "I will not forget. I will come back for you." Astrid did not fully understand what he meant, but she felt that something profound had been born in those 3 days, a connection that had no name or explanation. That same night, when she returned to the rocks, the boy had disappeared. Only a small turquoise amulet remained among the stones, which Astrid kept as her most precious treasure. The years passed and Astrid became a woman, but that memory remained vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She knew it was absurd, that probably the boy did not even remember her, that perhaps he had not even survived the constant conflicts between his people and the Norwegian forces. But that inexplicable connection had left a mark on her heart that no suitor from Ravensholm could erase. Until Harald Grimson arrived. Harald was the son of one of the richest jarls in the region, a 30-year-old man who had returned from fighting in the east with airs of grandeur and a reputation that preceded his steps. He was handsome in a conventional way, with a carefully trimmed beard and impeccable manners in public. Erik the Wealthy saw in him the perfect opportunity, a son-in-law who would consolidate his social position and who was also willing to accept Astrid despite the fact that she had already rejected so many others. What no one knew, what Harold hid beneath his facade of refined gentleman, was that he had returned from the East fleeing gambling debts that had ruined his reputation in the warrior halls. He desperately needed Astrid's dowry and was willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. The engagement was announced one afternoon in September, when the cold began to settle in and the first snows brought relief to the parched earth. Astrid heard the news sitting in the main hall, surrounded by her family and the Grimsons, feeling as if the walls were closing in around her. She tried to protest, to say that she barely knew Harold, that she needed time, but her mother silenced her with a look that admitted no reply. "You have rejected enough suitors," Gunhild declared coldly. "Harold is a man of worth who is willing to accept you despite your age and your eccentricities. You should be grateful." The months that followed were a nightmare of preparations. Gunhild organized every detail of what would be the social event of the season, while Astrid felt increasingly like a prisoner awaiting execution. Harold visited her regularly, always correct in the presence of others, but Astrid noticed something disturbing in the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. A possessiveness that made her feel like an object he already considered his. It was Helga who revealed the truth 2 weeks before the wedding. The old servant had overheard a conversation between Harold and a mysterious visitor who had arrived at midnight. Trembling with fear and loyalty to the girl she had watched grow up, Helga sought Astrid in her room. "Child," she whispered urgently, "you must leave here. That man, that Harold, I heard his plans. After the wedding, he intends to send you away to a convent or something worse. He has terrible debts. He needs your dowry, but he doesn't want you as a wife. You're just a means to save his reputation and fill his pocket." Astrid felt the ground open beneath her feet. For a moment she could not breathe. The room spun around her, but then, like fresh water in the middle of the desert, came clarity. She could not allow this to happen. She could not become a victim of a man who only saw her as a way to solve his problems. She had spent too many years being invisible, being a disappointment, being what others expected of her. If her life was going to be ruined, at least it would be by her own decisions. That night, while the house slept and only the stars were witnesses, Astrid packed the bare minimum in a small bag. Simple clothes that could go unnoticed, the money she had saved from small gifts, her grandfather's medicine books, and the turquoise amulet she had kept for 15 years. Helga had given her directions to reach a neighboring town where she could take a coach, but Astrid knew her family would search for her in all civilized places. She made a decision that any sane person would have considered madness. She would head toward the wilderness, toward the territories where the northern Viking clans still maintained their way of life, far from the control of the Norwegian crown. If she was going to disappear, she would do it in a place where no one would think to look for her. And in the deepest part of her heart, a part of her still held the absurd hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she would find the boy who once promised to return. When the sun began to paint the horizon pink and gold, Astrid was already several hours away from Ravensholm, walking toward an uncertain future, but finally her own. The wilderness does not forgive the ignorant or the desperate. Astrid learned this during the first hours under the merciless cold that turned each step into torture. She had grown up seeing the northern forests from her bedroom window, admiring their wild beauty, but she had never truly understood their merciless nature. Now, with her throat dry from the cold air and her feet bleeding inside her lady's shoes that were never designed for walking on rough terrain, she began to question the sanity of her decision. The first day she had walked guided by fury and determination. Each time exhaustion threatened to stop her, she thought of Harold, of her mother, of all the years she had spent feeling that her life did not belong to her. That rage kept her moving even when the freezing wind struck her with brutal force. She had brought water, but not enough. She had thought she would find some stream or well along the way, but the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, mocking her naivety. By the time night fell, Astrid could barely stay on her feet. She took refuge among some rocks that still retained some warmth, wrapped in her cloak, while the night cold of the wilderness replaced the biting wind with a temperature that made her shiver. She had not brought enough blankets, had not considered how much the temperature could change, had not considered many things. She curled up among the stones, hugging her bag as if it were the only thing connecting her to reality, and cried for the first time since making the decision to flee. But crying served no purpose in the wilderness. The second day dawned with Astrid rising with every muscle in her body protesting. Her lips were cracked, her skin reddened by the cold. and thirst was a constant presence occupying every thought. She had finished the water during the night and now walked without a defined direction, searching for any sign of life, of water, of something that was not snow and endless rocks. It was mid-afternoon when she began to hallucinate. The cold struck her mercilessly, and her mind began to play tricks on her. She saw shelters that disappeared when she approached. She heard voices that did not exist. She felt that the wilderness itself was watching her with ancient and cruel eyes. At some point she fell to her knees, unable to take another step. The turquoise amulet hung from her neck, burning her skin with accumulated cold. And Astrid thought it was ironic that she was going to die with the only memory of that boy she had saved so many years ago. "I'm sorry," she murmured to the wind, not knowing if she was speaking to the boy from her memories, to herself, or to the wilderness that was about to claim her. "I tried to be brave." She didn't know how much time passed lying on the cold ground, floating between consciousness and darkness. The next thing she would remember was the sound of hooves, voices speaking in a language she did not understand, and strong but careful hands lifting her from the ground. She tried to open her eyes, but the light was too bright, too painful. The last thing she perceived before completely losing consciousness was the smell of wood smoke and medicinal herbs, and a strange sensation that perhaps, against all logic, she was going to survive. When she finally awoke, the world had transformed into something completely different. She was lying on soft furs inside a structure that took several seconds to identify as a traditional Viking longhouse. Light entered, filtered through the walls, creating patterns that danced gently with the breeze. There was a small fire in the center, and near it, an elderly woman was preparing something in a clay pot. Astrid tried to sit up, but her body refused to obey. Every muscle protested. Her throat was so dry she could not make a sound, and her skin burned as if she were still under the freezing wind. The old woman turned toward her, and her dark eyes studied her with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "Quiet, child," said the woman in broken but understandable Norwegian. "You almost died. You need to rest." She approached with a bowl of fresh water and helped Astrid drink slowly. The liquid going down her throat was the most glorious sensation she had experienced in her life. "Where?" Astrid tried to ask, but her voice came out as a barely audible croak. "You are in Wolfden Canyon," responded the old woman. "My nephews found you when they were patrolling the territory. They said you were more dead than alive." She continued, applying a fresh ointment to Astrid's cold burns. "I am Sigrid. I am a healer. Now you rest, and when you are stronger, you will tell me what a Norwegian girl from a good family is doing wandering alone through the wilderness." The days that followed were a fog of sleeping, waking to drink water and eat light broths that Sigrid prepared, and sleeping again. Astrid's body was slowly recovering from the damage her desperate flight had caused. But along with physical recovery came the terrible understanding of her situation. She was completely alone, in Viking territory, with no way to return and not knowing what awaited her. It was on her 5th day of recovery when Sigrid finally asked her directly what had brought her there. Astrid, feeling strangely safe with that old woman of wise gaze, told her everything. She spoke of her family, of the forced engagement, of Harold and his terrible plans, of her desperate decision to flee. She did not mention the Viking boy from her memories. That was too intimate, too absurd to share. Sigrid listened in silence, nodding occasionally, and when Astrid finished her story, the old woman remained thoughtful for a long while. "You have a brave heart," she finally said. "But you are also very foolish. The wilderness kills the brave as much as the cowards." She sighed, stirring the herbs she was grinding. "You cannot stay here forever. My people do not trust Norwegians. We have lost too much at the hands of your people." "I know," murmured Astrid, feeling the weight of truth. "I don't expect them to accept me. I just needed to escape. I needed to choose my own destiny, even if it was just once in my life." "And what destiny did you choose?" asked Sigrid with a touch of irony. "To die in the wilderness?" Astrid had no answer for that. She had not thought beyond escaping. She had not considered what would come after. The enormity of her impulsiveness struck her forcefully, and for a moment she felt she was going to cry again. But then Sigrid did something unexpected. She laughed. It was a soft laugh, almost affectionate. "You remind me of myself when I was young," she said. "I also fled once. I also thought I preferred to die free than live in a golden cage." She approached and took Astrid's hands in hers, weathered by years of work. "There is a meeting tonight. The leaders will decide what to do with you. Some will want you to leave immediately. Others will want to use you to negotiate with the Norwegians. But I will tell my nephew to look into your eyes before deciding. Eyes do not lie about a person's heart." That night, when the sun began to set, painting the canyon in impossible colors, Sigrid led Astrid toward the center of the camp. It was the first time she had left the healer's dwelling since her arrival, and what she saw took her breath away. Wolfden Canyon was beautiful in a wild and ancient way. The dwellings were strategically distributed among the rocks, taking advantage of the natural shade and the protection the terrain offered. There were children playing, women working on various tasks, men preparing weapons and tools. It was a living community, functioning with a harmony that Astrid had never seen in her own town. In the center of the camp, around a bonfire, several men were gathered. Astrid felt the weight of their gazes evaluating her, measuring whether she was a threat or a victim, whether she was worth the risk of keeping her there. But there was one in particular whose presence dominated the space without need for words. He was tall, of strong build, with black hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes that seemed to see through people. He wore war marks on his arms and a scar that crossed his left eyebrow. When Sigrid presented her, the man studied her in silence for a moment that felt eternal. Astrid held his gaze, refusing to show the fear she felt. Something in his eyes seemed familiar, but she could not identify what. "My name is Erik," he finally said in perfect Norwegian. "I lead this clan. Sigrid says you fled from your family, that you preferred to risk your life rather than marry a cruel man." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "Is this true?" "Yes," responded Astrid with a firm voice despite her internal trembling. "It is true. And what do you expect from us?" Astrid took a deep breath. "I expect nothing. I have no right to ask for anything, but if you allow me to stay, even temporarily, I will work. I know medicine. I can help Sigrid. I can make my presence worthwhile." Erik observed her for another long moment. Then he looked at the turquoise amulet hanging from Astrid's neck, visible above her simple clothes. Something changed in his expression, a spark of recognition that disappeared so quickly Astrid thought she had imagined it. "You may stay," he finally said. "For now." The days turned into weeks, and Astrid began to find her place in Wolfden Canyon in a way she had never imagined possible. Each morning she awoke when the sun barely painted the canyon walls pink and headed to Sigrid's dwelling to help her with medicinal preparations. The old woman proved to be a patient but demanding teacher who did not tolerate mistakes when it came to dosages or mixtures that could mean the difference between healing and harming someone. "Plants do not forgive ignorance," Sigrid would say while teaching her to identify herbs that grew in the cracks of the rocks. "You must know them as you know your own heart. Know when a leaf is at its perfect point, when a root has all its strength, when the sun has dried a flower too much and it no longer serves." Astrid absorbed each teaching with a thirst that went beyond the simple desire to be useful. For the first time in her life, she felt she was learning something that truly mattered, something she could use to touch the lives of others in a tangible way. The knowledge she had acquired from her grandfather's books began to make sense when combined with Sigrid's practical wisdom. They were two different traditions that, when mixed, created something more powerful than either alone. The community began to accept her slowly. At first, the looks were of open distrust, especially from the women who saw her as an intruder who had not earned her place there. But when the small son of one of the families fell ill with a high fever that would not yield to traditional treatments, Sigrid asked Astrid to prepare a special tincture that her grandfather had used for similar cases. The boy recovered in 2 days, and the mother, a woman named Inga, who until then had avoided even looking at her, brought her a piece of bread as silent thanks. But if there was someone Astrid could not decipher, it was Erik. The leader appeared at unexpected moments, always with some practical reason, bringing plants he had found during his patrols, consulting with Sigrid about the health of some wounded warrior, verifying that everything was in order in the camp. But Astrid felt his gaze on her, even when he pretended to be concentrated on something else. There was something in the way he observed her, an intensity that made her feel as if she were being constantly evaluated, though she did not know by what criteria or for what purpose. One afternoon, while Astrid was gathering medicinal roots near the stream that fed the camp, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Eric watching her from a prudent distance, with that inscrutable expression that seemed to be his natural state. "Sigrid says you learn quickly," he commented without preamble, slowly approaching. "She says you have an instinct for healing, that you don't just follow instructions, but understand the why behind each preparation." Astrid did not know how to respond to the compliment. In her previous life, praise had always come loaded with conditions, or followed by criticism. "My grandfather taught me well," she finally responded, concentrating on the plants in her hands. "He said that plants speak if you know how to listen." Eric knelt beside her and took one of the roots she had unearthed, examining it with fingers that knew both the delicacy necessary for healing and the strength required for war. "That amulet you wear," he suddenly said, his voice tenser than Astrid had heard before. "Where did you get it?" Astrid's heart gave a lurch. For weeks she had waited for this question. She had rehearsed answers in her mind during sleepless nights. But now that the moment finally arrived, all those carefully prepared answers evaporated. She touched the turquoise amulet hanging from her neck, feeling its familiar weight against her skin. "Someone gave it to me a long time ago," she responded carefully, studying his face for any sign of recognition. "When I was a child, I helped a boy who was wounded, and he left this for me before he left." She paused, feeling she was on the edge of something important but dangerous. "I never knew his name. I only remember he had eyes like yours." The silence that followed was so dense that Astrid could hear her own heart beating. Eric had remained completely still, looking at the amulet with an intensity that made the air between them seem to vibrate. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, loaded with an emotion he had not shown before. "I also remember a girl," he said slowly, as if each word cost him physical effort. "A girl with honey-colored eyes who was not afraid to help a Viking boy when any other person of her class would have left me to die. A girl who saved my life and to whom I promised I would return, though I did not know how to fulfill that promise." He looked up at her, and Astrid saw in his eyes the same boy she had known 15 years ago. "That amulet was my mother's. I gave it to you because it was the only thing of value I had with me." Astrid's world stopped. For all those years she had kept the absurd hope of seeing that boy again, but she had never truly believed it would happen. And now here he was, turned into a man, into a leader, into someone who had built an entire life in the years they had been separated. Tears began to roll down her cheeks without her being able to control them. "I thought you were a dream," she murmured. "Something my mind had invented to have something beautiful to remember." She wiped the tears with the back of her hand, feeling a mixture of joy and pain so intense it was almost unbearable. "And then my life became so terrible that even that memory stopped being enough consolation." Eric slowly extended his hand and touched her cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb in a gesture of tenderness that completely contrasted with his warrior appearance. "I tried to find you," he confessed. "For years, every time we had contact with Norwegians, I asked about a girl with honey-colored eyes who lived near Ravensholm, but the world is large, and I was just a boy without resources or influence." His voice broke slightly. "I never thought fate would bring you back to me this way." The initiation trials would begin at dawn on the third day, but that night Astrid could not sleep. She rose silently and left the dwelling she shared with Sigrid, needing fresh air and space to order her thoughts. The canyon was bathed in the silver light of the full moon, creating shadows that danced among the rocks like ancient spirits watching her destiny. She was not alone. Eric was sitting on a high rock, looking at the stars with a thoughtful expression. When he heard her approach, he turned, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but loaded with everything they had not yet dared to say. "Are you afraid?" he finally asked, making space for her beside him on the rock. Astrid climbed up and sat down, their shoulders almost touching. "I am terrified," she admitted with honesty that surprised even herself, "but not of the trials. I am afraid of failing, of being expelled and never seeing you again. I spent 15 years keeping your memory like a treasure, and now that I found you—" Her voice broke. "I don't know if I could bear losing you again." Eric took her hand, intertwining his fingers with a delicacy that contrasted with his warrior hands. When you left that time, when I was a boy, I promised myself that if I ever found you again, I would not let anything separate us." His eyes shone with contained emotion. "But now I understand that I cannot promise you that. This world is cruel, and circumstances are sometimes stronger than will. The only thing I can promise you is that I will fight for you with every breath I have left." Astrid felt tears rolling down her cheeks. "In my family, no one ever fought for me. I was the daughter who was left over, the mistake that had to be corrected. And now you." She could not finish the sentence. He dried her tears with his thumb, his face inches from hers. "Now you have someone who sees your true worth, who sees your courage, your compassion, your strength, who sees you complete and beautiful exactly as you are." He paused, his voice becoming a hoarse whisper. "Who loves you with an intensity that frightens me." The kiss that followed was as inevitable as dawn, soft at first, then deeper, loaded with 15 years of waiting and all the love they had kept without knowing for whom. When they separated, both were trembling. "Whatever happens in the trials," Eric murmured against her forehead, "you are already part of me. Where I am, there will be your home." The trials proved to be more challenging than Astrid had anticipated. They were not physical, but spiritual and mental. Fasting for a full day while gathering plants in the wilderness under the cold, preparing a complex medicine under the critical supervision of the elders, and finally, spending a night alone in the mountains facing her deepest fears. It was during that solitary night, sitting in a cave with only the echo of her own thoughts, that Astrid finally understood something fundamental. She had spent her entire life seeking external approval, trying to be enough for her family, for society, for everyone except herself. But here, in the absolute darkness of the northern night, she finally found herself. She was not the rejected daughter or the fugitive bride. She was Astrid, healer, survivor, woman who had chosen her own path, even when that path led her toward the unknown. When she returned to the camp at dawn, something had changed in her eyes. Sigrid saw it immediately and smiled with satisfaction. "Now you truly are one of us," declared the old woman before the entire gathered community, "not for having passed the trials, but because you have found your true spirit." But the celebration was abruptly interrupted when a lookout came running with news that froze Astrid's blood. A group of Norwegians had been seen approaching the canyon, led by an elegant man asking about a disappeared woman. Harold had found her. Eric turned toward her, his expression hardening with determination. "I am not going to let them take you," he declared. But Astrid stopped him with a gesture. "No," she said with a calm that surprised even herself. "I spent months fleeing, letting fear dictate my decisions, but I'm no longer that woman. Let me face him, but in my own way." When Harold entered the camp with his armed men, he expected to find a terrified and submissive Astrid. What he found was a transformed woman standing beside her new community, with the clear gaze of one who finally knows her own worth. "Astrid," Harold began with a controlled voice, "I have come to take you home. Your family is devastated. The scandal has been terrible. This is my home now," she responded with a firm voice that resonated throughout the canyon. "And as for the scandal, you are the one who should worry about that. I know about your debts, your plans to get rid of me after taking my dowry. Do you want me to share that information with everyone who is searching for me?" Harold's face lost color. He had completely underestimated the woman before him. "No one will believe a fugitive," he tried, but his voice no longer had the same confidence. "Perhaps not," Astrid conceded, "but I no longer need them to believe me. I no longer need the approval of a society that only valued me for my surname. I have found my true purpose here, saving lives and being loved for who I truly am." She took a step forward, her presence filling the space. "Return and tell my family that Astrid, Eric's daughter, died in the wilderness. The woman I am now does not belong to them, nor does she owe them anything." Harold attempted one last intimidation maneuver, but the collective gaze of the Viking community, with Erik at the front, made it clear it would be unwise to press further. He withdrew with his men, defeated not by violence, but by the unbreakable force of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own life. That night, under the same stars that had witnessed her desperate arrival months ago, Astrid married Erik according to the traditions of her adopted people. There were no silk dresses or crystal chandeliers, only two souls who had found each other, lost each other, and found each other again against all odds. Sigrid officiated the ceremony with tears of joy in her ancient eyes. "True love," said the old healer as she tied the couple's hands with a ceremonial rope, "knows no borders of race or class. It flourishes where it finds fertile ground, and you two have cultivated the most beautiful garden in the wilderness." Years later, when travelers told stories about a legendary healer who lived in Wolfton Canyon, a woman who had rejected wealth and privilege to find something more valuable, Astrid smiled as she treated her patients. She had begun as the unwanted daughter, she had become the desperate fugitive, and finally, she had bloomed as the woman she was always destined to be. Her story was not about escaping a terrible life, but about having the courage to build an extraordinary one. And every time she looked at Eric, every time she touched the turquoise amulet that now hung beside her own healer's necklace, she remembered that the most beautiful endings often begin with the bravest acts of faith. The wilderness that had almost killed her had become her home. The people she should have feared had become her family. And the boy she had saved at 8 years old had become the love of her entire life. Some would say it was destiny. Astrid knew it was something better. It was the reward for daring to choose her own happiness. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating stories about history's greatest figures and events.